Welcome back, my jewels. As always, before we begin, grab your scuba gear because today we're diving beneath the surface. This conversation isn't one I expect everyone to agree with, and that's perfectly fine. The purpose of the fishbowl has never been to tell people what to think. It's been to encourage us to think. Sometimes we climb into this bowl to examine the world around us, and other times we climb in to examine ourselves. Today, I think we're going to do a little bit of both. We're talking about grief, not grief from the perspective of how to survive it or how long it should last. Today, we're talking about something that rarely gets discussed: the expectations we place on grieving people. Somewhere along the way, society created an unwritten handbook on what grief is supposed to look like. Cry, but don't cry too much. Be strong, but don't appear cold. Return to work, but not too soon. Smile eventually, but not too soon, or someone might think you didn't love the person enough. If you're too emotional, people worry. If you're too composed, people question whether you're grieving at all. It's almost as if grief has become a performance the world believes it has the right to critique. And that makes me wonder, who wrote those rules? Where did they come from? Who decided sorrow only counts if it's visible? Who decided tears are the only evidence of love? Who decided laughter and grief cannot exist in the same heart at the same time? Because if we're honest, many of us have silently judged someone else's grief. Maybe we didn't say it out loud, but we thought it. She's handling this too well. He's not emotional enough. She went back to work awfully fast. He smiled at the funeral. She's posting pictures on social media. He's laughing with his friends. Without realizing it, we become critics of someone else's grief while never considering that grief is one of the most deeply personal experiences a human being will ever endure. And that's why I want to begin today's conversation with something important. This episode is not about deciding anyone's guilt or innocence. It isn't about relitigating criminal cases. It isn't about telling people how they should grieve. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about asking whether we, as a society, have become so accustomed to expecting grief to fit inside a neat little box that we've forgotten grief doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the person carrying it. Over the years, I've noticed something. Whenever tragedy strikes, people don't just mourn the loss. They begin evaluating the people left behind. They study every facial expression, every interview, every photograph, every social media post, every smile, every tear, every moment of silence. It's almost as if we're searching for evidence that someone is grieving correctly. And if their grief doesn't resemble what we imagine our own would look like, we begin to question them. We become suspicious. We wonder if something is wrong with them, or worse, we assume their response tells us something about their character. But here's the truth. None of us know how we'll grieve until grief arrives. We think we know. We imagine what we'll do. We picture ourselves crying every day, or never leaving the house, or holding on to every belonging forever. And then life happens. Loss happens. And we discover that grief doesn't ask our permission before it changes us. Psychologists have spent decades studying grief, and one of the greatest misconceptions is that everyone experiences it the same way. Many of us have heard of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those stages became so well known that people often believe grief follows them like stepping stones, but that's not how grief works for most people. Even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross later clarified that those stages were never intended to be a roadmap. Human beings don't grieve in straight lines. We move back and forth. We revisit emotions we thought we'd already worked through. We can feel acceptance one morning and overwhelming sadness that evening. We can laugh at breakfast because of a funny memory and cry ourselves to sleep that night because we suddenly remember they're gone. Grief is not organized. It is not orderly. It is not predictable. It is deeply human. Our brains are remarkable, but they are fragile when faced with profound loss. Neuroscientists explain that grief affects the brain's ability to process reality. When someone we love dies, our mind understands what has happened, but another part of us continues expecting them to walk through the door, answer the phone, or sit in their favorite chair. That's why people often reach for the phone to call someone who has passed away, or instinctively buy their favorite snack before remembering they're gone. It isn't because they're losing their minds, it's because love doesn't disappear the moment someone dies. The brain needs time to reconcile a world that suddenly feels unfamiliar. That's why grief looks different for everyone. Some people cry openly, some become quiet, some throw themselves into work, some withdraw, some laugh more than ever because laughter becomes the only thing keeping them afloat. Some become caretakers, focusing on everyone else's pain while ignoring their own. Some don't cry until months later, some cry for years, some need to talk about the person every day. Others can barely say their name. Which one is right? Perhaps all of them. One of our greatest mistakes is assuming that because someone doesn't grieve the way we would, they must not be grieving at all. But grief isn't measured by tears or silence or how often someone visits a cemetery or how quickly they return to work. It isn't measured by whether they smile in a photograph 6 months later. Grief is measured by something the public never sees: the relationship, the memories, the conversations only two people shared, the dreams that died alongside the person who is gone. We see behavior. We do not see the heart. Sociologists tell us that every society creates expectations around major life events, and grief is no exception. We have rituals, colors we wear, voices we lower, flowers we bring, meals we deliver. Those traditions are beautiful because they remind grieving people they are not alone. But somewhere along the way, traditions became expectations, and expectations became judgments. Instead of allowing people to grieve in ways that reflect their personality, culture, faith, and relationship, we quietly compare them to an invisible standard no one ever agreed to. And if you travel around the world, you'll discover there is no universal way to grieve. Some cultures sing and dance at funerals, others mourn quietly, some wear black, others wear white, some celebrate birthdays after someone has passed, others avoid them because it hurts too much. None of these traditions are right or wrong. They simply reflect different understandings of love, loss, memory, and hope. So, why do we become uncomfortable when someone grieves differently than we would? I think it's because grief forces us to confront our own mortality. When we watch someone lose a spouse, a child, a parent, or a sibling, we can't help imagining ourselves in that position. We silently ask, "What would I do?" Then, without realizing it, we measure someone else's behavior against an experience we've never lived. We create expectations based on imagination instead of reality. Jules, if there's one thing I hope you begin thinking about before we continue, it's this. Perhaps grief isn't something we're meant to understand from the outside. Perhaps grief is something we're meant to honor from a distance. Because the truth is, we don't know what someone whispers when no one else is listening. We don't know what memories keep them awake at night. We don't know what anniversaries they dread. We don't know how many tears they've cried in private before ever stepping into public. All we see is a moment. But grief is never just a moment, it's a journey, and every journey looks different. As we continue our dive beneath the surface, I want to explore something that has fascinated me for years. And if I'm being completely honest, it has also deeply concerned me. It seems that whenever tragedy strikes, the public doesn't simply mourn alongside the family. Instead, we transform ourselves into investigators, body language experts, psychologists, and grief specialists. We analyze every tear, every smile, every interview, every social media post, every photograph, every expression, and every word. Somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that if we study someone's grief closely enough, we can determine the truth about who they are. But can we? Or are we simply projecting our own expectations onto someone else's pain? One case that immediately comes to mind is the case of Darlie Routier, a case many of us here in Texas remember vividly. Before I go any further, I want to make something absolutely clear. This episode is not about determining whether Darlie Routier is guilty or innocent. She was convicted of murdering her two young sons, Devin and Damon, and she has continued to maintain her innocence throughout the years while remaining on death row. The legal process is separate from the conversation we're having today. What I want to examine is something much different. I want to examine the court of public opinion and the role grief played in shaping it. Many people remember the now famous cemetery footage. On what would have been one of her son's birthdays, cameras captured family members celebrating his life at the cemetery. There was silly string, there was laughter, there were smiles. There were moments that many described as shocking, inappropriate, and unbelievable. News stations across the country replayed those clips repeatedly, and almost overnight, people began asking themselves, what kind of mother laughs at her child's grave? For many, the conclusion had already been reached long before a courtroom ever did. They believed grief should look one way, and because what they witnessed didn't fit that expectation, they questioned everything else. But here's what many people either didn't know or never saw. The cemetery footage that was played repeatedly on television wasn't the entire visit. Reports over the years have noted that the full recording also included moments of prayer, crying, and quiet remembrance before the family celebrated the child's birthday. Whether someone believes Darlie Routier is guilty or innocent is not my point today. My point is this: public opinion was influenced by selected moments that didn't fit society's expectation of what grief should look like. And that raises an important question. Are we judging a person's heart, or are we judging a moment in time? Now, pause with me for just a second, Jules. Think about birthdays. Aren't birthdays supposed to be celebrations? If someone chooses to celebrate the life of a loved one by releasing balloons, sharing funny stories, singing happy birthday, or yes, even spraying silly string because that's what their child loved, who are we to decide that's wrong? Does joy cancel out grief? Or can joy exist because of love? Can someone cry in one moment and laugh in another? I believe they can. Psychologists have long understood that grief isn't simply sadness. Grief is the emotional response to losing someone we love. But love itself is made up of memories, experiences, traditions, laughter, holidays, inside jokes, and countless shared moments. When we remember those moments, our emotions naturally shift. That's why someone can cry while looking through old photographs and suddenly laugh because they remembered something funny that happened 20 years ago. Does the laughter mean the grief disappeared? Of course not. It means grief and joy have learned to occupy the same space. We also underestimate the role our brains play in protecting us. Trauma researchers tell us that after significant loss, the brain often moves in and out of emotional intensity. Sometimes it allows us to cry. Other times it allows us to laugh. Sometimes it numbs us altogether because feeling everything all at once would be too overwhelming. Have you ever heard someone say, I don't know why I laughed after a funeral? It isn't because they didn't care. Sometimes the nervous system is simply trying to survive. Human beings are incredibly complex, and our emotional responses don't always make sense to people watching from the outside. I've noticed this same pattern in more recent cases. As many of you know, the tragic death of Nolan Wells has generated significant public attention. Like many highly publicized cases, people have closely watched the family, particularly his mother. I've seen comments praising her strength. I've also seen comments questioning why she appears so composed. I've read remarks suggesting she isn't grieving the way people expected a grieving mother to grieve. And every time I read those comments, I find myself asking the same question. Based on what? Based on whose standard? Where is it written that a grieving mother must cry every time she appears in public? Where is it written that strength somehow means the absence of pain? Perhaps what we're witnessing isn't a lack of grief at all. Perhaps we're witnessing someone doing the only thing they know how to do to survive the unimaginable. One of the greatest misconceptions about grief is that it should be visible at all times. But grief isn't a performance. It isn't something people put on display to satisfy the public. There are people who cry privately and smile publicly. There are people who become the strongest person in the room because everyone else is falling apart. There are people who don't shed a single tear during the funeral because they're making arrangements, comforting family members, signing paperwork, greeting guests, and making sure everyone else is okay. Then 6 months later, they're standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store, hear a song playing over the speakers, and suddenly they're overwhelmed with emotion. Was their grief any less real because it didn't appear on the day everyone expected it to? Jules, I want to make this conversation personal because I never ask you to reflect without reflecting myself. When I lost my father, I discovered something I never expected. I experienced every emotion imaginable. There were days when I cried because the loss felt unbearable. There were moments when I laughed because I remembered one of his stories or something funny he used to say. There were quiet moments when I simply sat with my thoughts. And there were moments when I smiled because I knew my father would never have wanted me to spend the rest of my life trapped in sorrow. And that made me wonder something. If someone had watched me during those different moments, which one would they have believed? Would they have believed the tears? Would they have believed the laughter? Would they have believed the silence? The truth is, they would have only seen a snapshot of my grief. They never would have seen my heart. No one knows the conversations I had with my father. No one knows what he taught me. No one knows what I miss. No one knows the moments I still think about when no one else is around. That's why I believe it's dangerous to judge someone's grief based on a single photograph, a single interview, or a 30-second video clip. Human beings are far too complex to be understood through isolated moments. Sometimes I think about what my father would have wanted for me. Would he have wanted me to laugh again? I believe so. Would he have wanted me to continue living? Absolutely. Would he have wanted me to carry his memory with joy instead of only pain? I believe he would. So when I smile while thinking about him, that smile isn't evidence that I didn't love him. It's evidence that I loved him enough to carry the best parts of him forward. And perhaps that's what we forget. Grief isn't only about death. Grief is also about love. You cannot grieve someone deeply unless you first loved them deeply. The depth of our grief often reflects the depth of our connection, but the expression of that grief is as unique as the relationship itself. Two children can lose the same parent and grieve differently because they didn't have the exact same relationship. A husband and wife may grieve differently because they carry different memories. One sibling may need to talk constantly, while another needs silence. Neither is wrong. They're simply carrying different versions of the same loss. There's one thing I've learned about grief. It's that none of us gets to decide how another person's heart should heal. We may have experienced loss ourselves, but our loss is not their loss. Our relationship is not their relationship. Our memories are not their memories. We often say things like, I know exactly how you feel, but do we? Even if two people lose the same person, they don't lose the same relationship. One child may have talked to their mother every single day. Another may have spent years trying to repair a broken relationship. One sibling may remember bedtime stories, vacations, and laughter. Another may remember distance, disappointment, and silence. They are grieving the same person, but they are grieving completely different relationships. That's why comparison has no place in grief. One of the things we don't talk about enough is something psychologists refer to as anticipatory grief. Sometimes people begin grieving before death ever occurs. Think about the family caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease. They begin mourning pieces of that person long before their physical death because they watch memories disappear, personalities change, and conversations become fewer and fewer. The same can happen When someone has terminal cancer or another long term illness, family members may spend months or even years preparing themselves emotionally for a loss they know is coming. Then, when death finally occurs, people sometimes say they're handling it so well. What they don't realize is that grieving may have started long before the funeral. That doesn't mean the love was any less real. It simply means the journey began earlier than anyone else realized. Then there's delayed grief, something that surprises many people. Society often expects tears at the funeral, but sometimes survival takes over first. Someone has to make the arrangements. Someone has to notify family members. Someone has to choose the music, greet visitors, complete paperwork, close bank accounts, and comfort everyone else. They become so focused on helping others that their own grief quietly waits its turn. Then, weeks or months later, when life finally slows down, the emotions they've been holding back come rushing in all at once. That's why someone may seem perfectly composed on the day of the funeral, but break down months later while folding laundry, hearing a favorite song, or walking through a grocery store. Grief doesn't operate according to a calendar. It doesn't care about timelines. It simply arrives when the heart is ready, or sometimes when the heart has no choice. I also think we need to normalize something else. Grief isn't limited to death. We grieve divorce. We grieve miscarriages. We grieve infertility. We grieve friendships that ended without closure. We grieve the loss of our health, our careers, our independence, our homes, and sometimes the dreams we spent years building. Parents grieve the child who moved across the country. Children grieve the parent they wish they had. Sometimes we grieve people who are still living because the relationship we once had no longer exists. That's grief too. Yet, because society often associates grief only with death, people feel guilty for mourning other kinds of losses that are just as life altering, just as painful, and just as deserving of compassion. We've created a world where only certain types of grief are acknowledged, while others are quietly dismissed or minimized. But the heart doesn't categorize loss the way society does. The heart grieves what mattered. The heart grieves what changed. The heart grieves what will never be the same again. And when we deny ourselves permission to mourn those losses, we deny ourselves the healing that grief was designed to bring. This is also why I believe we need to be careful with the words we offer someone who is grieving. Most of us mean well, but good intentions don't always bring comfort. Telling someone everything happens for a reason may align with your beliefs, but it may not be what their heart needs in that moment. Saying, at least they're no longer suffering, may soothe some and wound others. Asking, aren't you over it yet? Or, you need to move on, assumes grief has an expiration date. It doesn't. Instead of feeling pressure to have the perfect words, perhaps we should become comfortable simply saying, I'm here. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer isn't advice, it's presence. Sometimes people don't need answers. They need someone willing to sit with them in the silence. From a social perspective, I also think we've created unrealistic expectations through social media. We often see carefully selected moments of people's lives and assume that's their entire reality. Someone posts a smiling picture, and people immediately begin commenting, well, I guess they're over it. But what if that photograph was taken after weeks of crying? What if that smile lasted 10 seconds before they went back home and sat alone with their thoughts? We don't know. Social media captures moments. It doesn't capture hearts. It doesn't capture sleepless nights. It doesn't capture the empty chair at the dinner table or the tears that come after everyone else has gone to bed. That's why we should be slow to judge what we think we understand from a single post or a single photograph. Jules, I also want to speak directly to those of you who are grieving right now. Maybe your loss happened yesterday. Maybe it happened 20 years ago. Maybe today, while listening to this episode, someone immediately came to mind. If that's you, I want you to hear me clearly. There is nothing wrong with you because your grief doesn't look like someone else's. If you cry every day, you're not weak. If you haven't cried yet, you're not heartless. If you laugh when you remember the person you lost, you're not disrespectful. If you celebrate their birthday every year, you're not strange. If you avoid the cemetery because it's too painful, you're not a bad son or daughter. If you visit every week because it brings you peace, you're not holding on too long. Your grief belongs to you. No one else gets to define it. No one else gets to measure it. No one else gets to grade it. One of the greatest acts of compassion we can offer one another is to stop asking whether someone is grieving correctly and instead ask how we can support them while they grieve. Imagine how different our communities would be if we spent less time evaluating people's emotions and more time extending grace. Imagine how healing it would be if we stopped expecting everyone to recover according to our schedule and instead allowed people the dignity of walking through grief at their own pace. As I think about today's conversation, I keep coming back to one simple truth. We see behavior, God sees the heart. We see interviews, God sees the sleepless nights. We see smiles, God sees the tears that never made it into public view. We see a photograph. God sees a lifetime of memories. That's why I'm becoming more careful about judging what I don't fully understand. Jules, grief has taught me something I didn't know before I experienced it. Love doesn't end when life ends. It simply changes its address. We carry the people we've loved in our stories, in our traditions, in our laughter, in our tears, and in the choices we make every day. Sometimes the greatest way we honor someone isn't by remaining broken forever. Sometimes it's by living the life they hoped we would live. So today, I want to leave you with a question to carry with you long after this episode ends. The next time you see someone grieving differently than you would, will you judge them? Or will you give them the same grace you hope someone would one day give you? Because here's what I believe. Grief is not a performance for the public. It is not something we owe the world. It is one of the most sacred expressions of love that we will ever experience. And love has never fit inside a box. Thank you, my jewels, for trusting me enough to have another difficult conversation beneath the surface. These conversations aren't always easy, but they're necessary because growth begins where judgment ends and understanding begins where assumptions stop. If today's conversation spoke to you, I encourage you to share this episode with someone who may need the reminder that their grief is valid, even if it doesn't look like anyone else's. Continue the conversation with your family, your friends, your coworkers, and your community. You never know whose heart might need permission to grieve without apology. Until next time, thank you for putting on your scuba gear and diving beneath the surface with me. Stay classy, stay curious, stay ever evolving. And remember, in this bowl, we don't judge people by the moments we see. We seek to understand the stories we don't. I'll see you beneath the surface.